Hello, my name is Danny. Welcome to episode 3 of the Frontline Baddies podcast. I'm here with co-founders Eileen. Say hi, Eileen.
Hey guys.
And Tracy is also joining us as well over Zoom.
Hi, everyone.
And this is Lou. He's probably going to be pretty vocal today, I feel like, and moving around. So if you wonder who the furry guy is, he's my dog. He's my emotional support French bulldog. Before we get into the episode, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge Frontline Baddies operates off of the north of Turtle Island. We strive for decolonization, land back, and acknowledgement of continued colonization through the Canadian government. We are a group of humans that are Indigenous, refugee, immigrant, and settlers to Turtle Island. We acknowledge our ancestors' plights for us to be here. We acknowledge our siblings' trauma in this line of work. We did not choose it. It chose us. This episode is really cool, I feel like, because we're going to be talking more about the historical context around harm reduction. And thank goodness, we have Eileen here, who is a harm reduction specialist, which is so cool. I love that. Always learn so much from her. Eileen, just coming from everything that you understand about harm reduction and your background and your specialty, maybe the first thing we kind of wanted to talk about, and I'd love to get Tracy's thought on this as well. Where did harm reduction come from? Like when we think of harm reduction, where did it all start? If you can give some perspective.
From everything that I've read and have researched, it's really hard to pinpoint exactly when harm reduction was officially established as a concept, because the idea has existed for a long time. Mm-hmm. People have been doing harm reduction in many different ways for a long time, but so the term harm reduction wasn't really official until the early 2000s, and people were already doing harm reduction stuff way before then, just on the down low or without much documentation. Just like Insight in Vancouver, it was just at someone's house at first. Had to pick where it all kicked off. I would say the Netherlands, Amsterdam. So back in the 70s and 80s, they were dealing with a heroin crisis, and HIV rates were skyrocketing. Mm-hmm. And so to get a better handle on things, Amsterdam was like, hey, let's try something new. Instead of punishing people who were using, they set up their first ever government-approved needle exchange program in the early 80s. When the infection rates were stabilizing, the idea caught on. Soon the UK and Australia were doing their own needle exchange in the 80s too.
Wow. Yeah, that's really cool. I didn't realize all of the history. Like I said, my background is not specifically within harm reduction. Obviously, that overlaps so much with the work that we do. A lot of it's completely, intertwined. Or in Eileen's case, that's the bulk of a lot of the things that she has special expertise in. Just from the little bit that I know, this is something that's around the globe used. Obviously, you're saying it's started in the Netherlands in terms of calling it harm reduction and referring to it to what it is known as today. But when I was looking at, I want to say it was harm reduction national or something online. And it was showing different maps of the world and where they were using different needle exchanges and where they weren't, if it was going to be in community and jails and hospitals, or if it was only in community, or if it was not at all. And it was kind of shocking to me, because I think we live in a little bubble sometimes in the downtown east side. And in Canada as well, in a way, that, when you think about other places in the world, maybe I thought it was more on the radar than it really is. So that's really cool to learn more about that. Tracy, what are your thoughts, and just based off of your experience?
So I think everything that you've said, Eileen, is true to what harm reduction is, and learning the history around, I guess, the substance use across the world, and how really even harm reduction in terms of substance use didn't start out because people were worried about overdoses. It was worried about bloodborne illnesses. I think it's very telling in terms of this is how people are getting their medical needs met. It's not because of thinking, how can we help individuals? It's always coming from a systems perspective of this isn't working how we're doing it now. So what can we change so that our system isn't as impacted by it? which is always interesting to me, that like essentially the only reason why harm reduction was like some of the information you just gave was adopted was because of the bloodborne illnesses being so hard on our entire system. And so then they're going to start needle exchanges, right? And this to me, and for me being American and coming from a state that is like, I would argue pretty anti-government, and how like the government operates as a system, it's really interesting to kind of think about my own experiences and like the history that we're taught in the States versus, you know, what the culture is up in Canada. And so when I think of harm reduction, it's not just about, I guess, substance use for me. And it's not just about putting systems first. When I was first exposed to the idea of harm reduction through a history class, say I was in like 6th grade, and I had a teacher who was explaining how Black women during slavery were some of the main healthcare providers for their communities. And she didn't get into, you know, reproductive care specifically, but just what she was explaining around how Black women have shown up, and Indigenous women as well have shown up and have supported their communities through this care, and how that care looks different than how even white women showed up for each other was really, really interesting to me. So something that I never quite ever like put down or walked away from. And what I learned over the years, I mean, I have a social justice degree, so I don't think it's too surprising that I never like fully just exited out of like learning about history and the social consequences of treating one group of people in a certain way versus another group of people in a systemic way, right? Which is what we're talking about, like that individualized care versus systems care, and how harm reduction with substances is a form of systems care. Even it's not even like that individualized care, and that's how it's come about, which is it. It's like a stomach punch for me personally, but way back in the day, it was individualized care, right? So essentially, the one of the first slave ships to come over was in 1619 in the United States, and these slave ships were really. I'm going to go into a history lesson, so just like bear with me because I get to my point, but it's important for people to understand the history. The slave ships were really like riddled with diseases. They were very dangerous to be on. You were on them for months at a time. And the slave quarters were at the bottom of the ship, and very rarely were they actually ever allowed to come up onto the top deck. So you can imagine, like, you know, where did their human waste go? What did that look like? The fact that there was rats on those boats, all of it, right? And a lot of people died on these ships alone. It was like 1 in 5 individuals making that passage died. In fact, this was further highlighted in one of the recent Black Panther movies, where one of the main characters is talking about his death. And he says a quote that, as an American, it hit me so hard. And I think being around Canadians at the time that it was released, it didn't have that same impact, but I need to say it because it goes into all of this with harm reduction. Bury me in the ocean with my ancestors who jumped from the ships because they knew death was better than bondage. And that was also true, right? So not only did you have 1 in 5 individuals dying on the ship itself, but then you had people who were jumping because they didn't want that life and they refused that life. And then they come over and they're treated like property. And that's the reality. Like, they were not seen as humans, they were not seen as individuals, and there was no individualized care. And like, that just was not even an option. And so what ended up happening was a lot of these women who were coming from Africa had knowledge of different types of herbs. And I think like the quote unquote, it's like herbs and medicines to help support themselves and other women, specifically in like their reproductive cycle. As a slave, when you would give birth, that child is not your child. That child is property of your slave owner. And depending on the slave owner, depends on if that child was going to stay with you or not. Slave owners would take children right after birth sometimes and send them to another plantation that they also owned, as a lot of women were trying to escape with their children. And so this is a way that slave owners could kind of keep their people, their property in check, as gross as this all is. And I don't think it's surprising to anyone, me explaining some of this. And specifically, because slave owners could not always keep their hands to themselves, if ever. Sometimes the Black woman would become pregnant by the hands of the slave owner. And that child was an especially dangerous child to have as a slave, because depending on the skin tone would depend on how that child would be treated the rest of their life. And it was at the time known which herbs and medicines could help maybe not have that child. Half the women that provided reproductive care from the 1700s to the 1800s were actually Black women. And the other half were Indigenous women and women who would be like considered nurses or quote unquote like maybe healthcare professionals, because they're not getting the same training that actual healthcare professionals are receiving at that time, because they're women and they don't have the same access to universities and. It wasn't until 1860 that termination of a pregnancy was illegal. And this actually was one of the main factors as to why, because plantation owners were getting angry that women were starting to have control over their own bodies, and the plantation owners' eyes, they weren't getting more property from women having that control and agency over their bodies. And so when we're talking about harm reduction, that's immediately where my mind goes. It goes back to the Indigenous women and the Black women who had knowledge of the land and of the plants and knew how to keep their people healthy during that time, and how to keep themselves and their children as safe as possible under horrific circumstances, and circumstances that were specifically set up against them not to work. So as Eileen's talking about, harm reduction with the needle exchange, my brain goes further back.
I think there's some contradictory, or people have like a contradictory notion of harm reduction, where, big fancy words people like to use, like enabling and like et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. When they're thinking about harm reduction, what they're really meaning is, you're just like exacerbating the problem. And that can be really harmful, not just to those, the conversations that people are having around it, but also to the communities that they're referencing, and to the, the frontline workers that are in those communities as well.
Yeah.
So I agree. Got to change that, man. When we talk about harm reduction, I think, and I'm, talking about that rhetoric, people don't really understand what harm reduction is or what it means, or maybe they're applying it in a way that is not really how we are talking about harm reduction, especially people outside, sometimes in frontline in healthcare, but a lot of times outside of frontline in healthcare. I just wanted to quickly state just like a basic harm reduction definition that I looked up. And it basically is just talking about policies, programs, and practices that aim to minimize the negative health, social, and legal impacts associated with, and we're using it in terms of, substance use in the work that we do, but basically the impacts associated with drug use, drug policies, and drug laws. Harm reduction is grounded in justice and human rights. So an example that was given was, around methadone being used, and opioid agonist therapies and theories. Also, I mean, like, really, if we want to get technical, like nicotine patches, drinking water in between your alcohol, like really basic stuff. It doesn't have to be so intensely intertwined with different political statements, which I think happens a lot when people talk about harm reduction that don't have the same experience. But I'd love to hear what you have to think
Yeah,
when people ask
so
what harm reduction really means. Take a
okay,
step
so yeah,
back.
I tend to ease folks into the idea of harm reduction by giving them everyday example of harm reduction, things that you wouldn't consider or label harm reduction, but it actually is. So one of the one of the examples I often use is diet soda. So we know that, you know, North America in general struggles with the excessive amount of sugar that we intake in our diet. And so, you know, the government and health officials were worried about it at one point, being like, oh, people are consuming too much sugar through sodas or whatnot. And, you know, they easily could have just made it illegal, right? Making soda illegal,
Sugar illegal.
right? But no, they knew that folks were still like the demand was there. Like people still wanted to drink their soda, whether you were going to tell them that it was bad for them or not. And so they were like, okay, maybe we need to come up with a safer solution or a safer alternative, which was diet soda, right? So that's an example of harm reduction for me. Another example would be seatbelts. You know, what's the number one cause of death in North America? Car collision. Do we make cars illegal? Obviously not. So what harm reduction like tools are we implementing that we put in seatbelts? It because it minimizes the harm that we know vehicles can cause, right? So do you have an example, Danny?
Absolutely. No, you took mine. Mine was seatbelts.
Oh.
That's what I came up with on my own. That was
Tracy,
mine.
do you have an example?
My go-to is having a bag of Skittles. And it's so funny because I know I'm in similar company in an interview. If someone goes, I need you to explain that a little bit more. And then I say, Skittles, you taste the rainbow. I've yet to meet an individual who just absolutely does not like Skittles. And if they don't, I usually have a chocolate bar in my bag. But the reason why I normally have Skittles and a chocolate bar as well as a smoke is that when someone is dysregulated, I would give them Skittles, or I would give them a chocolate bar, or I would give them a smoke, because just that form of regulation reduces harm. It reduces their escalation in the moment or their like emotional disturbance, whatever they're feeling. And so I believe in that. And it's funny, Eileen, because I know you know that, Eileen, from us working together historically, that I would just always have little goodies that I knew the kids would like, so that if something ever went too big, I could give them a little goodie. We'd go on a little walk. We'd blast music really loud outside the front. All of those things are forms of harm reduction, especially for people who might be trying to stay sober because that's their want in that moment or that's their need in that moment, right? And it is just really interesting to me, the focus of like how the stigma around harm reduction and how bad harm reduction is.
Now, if you ask me what harm reduction is in terms of this sector of work, harm reduction is holistic, it is trauma informed, it is radicalized empathy. That is my own definition. It recognizes that every individual has unique needs. Harm reduction is like looking at a whole picture when it comes to supporting a community member or client, not just focusing on their issue and trying to fix that issue specifically and doing like a one size fits all approach. It's about treating people as individuals, helping them stay healthy as much as they can, and empowering folks by giving them a say in their own well being and their own care. Plus, it's all about communities helping each other out and fighting against unfair treatment. And something that is so important about harm reduction is about getting rid of the judgment and stigma around mental health and substance use so that everyone feels supported and safe. So here's the deal with harm reduction. It's all about accepting that some folks might not ever get sober or fit into society's productive mold.
Mm-hmm.
But hey, that doesn't mean that they don't deserve basic human decency and support and care, right? Now, the big question people often ask is, what do we do with those who just can't seem to function in society? And
Mm.
honestly, I don't have the perfect answers or like all the answers. But here's what I imagine. I imagine a world where supportive housing is everywhere, well funded, and they're staffed with professionals who know their stuff when it comes to mental health and substance use.
Mm-hmm.
These places would be a lifeline for folks who might otherwise end up on the streets due to their mental health causing disruptions.
Mm-hmm.
Take one of my clients, for example, a guy dealing with serious schizophrenia and psychosis. He'd often get caught up in yelling fits in the middle of the night that go on for hours, and because he was hearing voices in his head, and to him that's like a real person that he was arguing with. So like you just cannot reason with him or tell him otherwise that this voice doesn't actually exist. And he would always risk getting kicked out of shelters or even facing threats from other folks in the shelter who are trying to get some sleep. When shit hits the fan at 2 in the morning and he's yelling and in psychosis, there's no one to call. There's no mental health professional to call to come handle this properly. And most of the time, staff just end up dialing 911, which is, let's be real, a terrible solution to any mental health crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And so just having these like supportive housing could really cater to these individuals and give them like the proper support that they need. Anticipating all their struggles so that like, you're not shocked that someone's like yelling at the
Mm-hmm.
top of their lung at 2 in the morning and having to like ask them to leave because of that.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up like the client with schizophrenia. Um, Both of you are aware that I have bipolar. This is not new. New information to y'all. It might be new information to everyone listening. But it's also something that I've advocated really hard for since I want to say like the last 10 years, as a person with like lived and living experience around how we should be treated in our psychological differences. And notice how I don't say illness, because I don't see it as an illness. And I think it's really important to talk about when we're talking about destigmatization and like gatekeeping resources specifically. Having bipolar has given me a lot of barriers to different resources. And many of those barriers tend to be around the medical field. In fact, I almost died a few years back due to my gallbladder exploding, going to a hospital, and the hospital writing it off as like a panic attack because I have PTSD as well. So they saw my file, they saw I have bipolar, they saw I have PTSD, and they just assumed you're just having a panic attack. Super condescending, super gaslighting. And I knew it wasn't, because that's not how I was feeling, was not how a panic attack shows up for me. Fast forward not even a full 48 hours later, and I'm in a different ER room in Vegas. I had jaundice. I wasn't even conscious anymore. And then the doctors decided, like, oh, yeah, you're not okay. And I had to have 3 emergency surgeries in less than 24 hours, to remove all the gallstones that were in my body and to remove what was left of my gallbladder. And it almost killed me. Like this stigma around mental health issues legitimately almost took my life, from a medical field, from the field that is supposed to understand them better than any other sector, if we're being honest. So I do have so many feelings around this. So I'm going to try to like keep them succinct, but much to your point, I mean, like a lot of people don't understand what it's like to see things and hear things that are not there. And I understand it's scary for them, because like what you're seeing walking down the street, or maybe what you're encountering, is a person who is talking to something or someone that isn't there. And that can be scary. But what that person's experiencing is like that thing is very real. And I don't think that that's talked about enough. Like, as someone who truly believed for different moments in my life that I had, like a winged creature coming at me at one point in a public setting, or that like I could hear my father yell at me, but I could not see him anywhere around me. And I knew he wasn't in the same city I was in. That's very scary. Like, that's a very scary thing as the individual who's actually going through it. And, someone sitting there telling you, like, it's not real, it's not real. It's like, well, one, I either already know it's not real and I'm already freaked out about that, so thank you. Or like, two, I didn't know it's real and now you're telling me it's not real. And now I'm freaked out because I thought it was real. And like, what am I supposed to do? Like, with that, what am I supposed to do? Truthfully, right? And I just don't think a lot of individuals understand the impact of some of these like mental health differences. Like, they just don't. I have a spectrum of emotion that a lot of other people will never be able to understand. Like, the depth of my emotion, the depth of my care and my love is something that I know is bigger than a lot of other people's. And it's not to like shame them, it's just like that's also never talked about, right? Like, some of the more positive things are not talked about being different in this way. Like, my compassion, I guess, Eileen, you call it radicalized empathy, which is funny because it's like harm reduction, right? But like, that compassion piece for me is so big, because I wish there is some times where like people would just show me some compassion when I really needed it, instead of like writing me off or saying that like you wear your heart on your sleeve, or like, and being condescending with all of it, right? Like, not ever, it's never in a positive way. Like, bipolar is never spoken about in a positive way. Schizophrenia is never spoken about in a positive way. And like, we are placed in this box of like being crazy. And I mean, yeah, we are. And isn't everyone? Like, it's crazy what we're currently doing and living in. Like, this entire structure is crazy. The fact that like we have the ability to control our communities and care and provide for our communities, and instead we're making a rat race of like who can make the most money and live the best, and like credit scores and all of these other things. Like, why? Like, for why are we doing that? I don't understand. That is something I don't understand. So when we're talking about the stigma, especially around like these mental health spaces, like, I've had police called on me when I'm in mania, and it's scary. And the police don't make it better, might I add. So just like, please don't do that ever, ever. Like, ask the individual if they're okay. Ask them what they're seeing. Like, ask them if they have a friend close by, or do they have a number because you're worried about them and like you want someone to come get them or whatever. But like, don't call police. Pretty please don't call police, because it's bad enough that I might be experiencing something that no one else can see, but then to be seen as a threat on top of that when I am not a threat in that way it puts me in more danger, right? And it puts everyone like me in more danger as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, those are really amazing points.
I've recently, I know both of you guys commented on this post, but like very recently I had to make a post in my personal life around it, because my pupils had dilated so big that I couldn't go about my day-to-day life, because the light coming in from my being in mania and my pupils dilating was giving me like a migraine. So like, that entire day, I essentially stayed in a very dark room because my pupils have gone like twice the size they normally are. And it just hurts. Like it hurts to be outside of a dark room, and it hurts to try to talk because I have a headache and I have a migraine now from it. And it's something so small, but just that one post, I got so many friends of mine who inboxed me. And it's not surprising because like kind of attracts like, but there was many individuals I did not know that were friends of mine that were diagnosed bipolar messaging me being like, I didn't know this was a thing. Like, I didn't know. This makes so much sense though. This has really always bugged me. And it's like, man, like even that, even the fact that we have this and there's not enough knowledge given to us around how it fully impacts our body. And the only reason I know that my pupils are dilated from mania is from being a huge freaking psych nerd and going down a whole rabbit hole of how it shows up and how you can tell if you're in mania versus depression and like what are the physiological signs and what are your physical signs and. That's the only way I would know. But my friends who haven't done those same types of deep dives are like, "Oh my god, this makes so much sense." And it's like, yeah. And how sad is that? How sad is it that they found that out over an Instagram post that I posted because I was just so done. I was just so done with the stigma around it. Like, I mean, it's cool because they get to learn something new about themselves and how they need to take care of themselves, but also very, very frustrating.
I think it's interesting how we just societally, this has kind of been a collective thing that we do where we feel as though that we need to categorize something so specifically into a nice little box and put a bow on it so that it makes sense for us. And harm reduction is not a nice, neat little box bow concept. And it really can't be and shouldn't be to incorporate and connect with everybody that it needs to help them and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we lose a lot of people when it comes to harm
You're
reduction.
absolutely right. Actually, that's such a good point, Danny. Like, harm reduction isn't pretty. Usually is not pretty. It's not a clean, perfect little box like you just said.
And I think it's really important to talk about harm reduction not just being for substance use. That harm reduction is also just reducing harm, right? The little history here in the last few years of what's been happening in the US around medicinal care for women and what that looks like and harm reduction
is coming to me now just based off of what you were saying. For myself, I can say this, it was around my reproductive health. And I ended up getting a surgery basically just due to myself ensuring that I wasn't going to give birth because that was going to be really catastrophic for myself if that were to happen with my body. There was lots of complications that could have happened and it took a really long time for someone to be on board with this surgery to help me. And I think that's maybe something that isn't talked about, like you had been talking about before. Harm reduction can come in so many different forms. It doesn't have to necessarily be around substance use. That's where the bulk of it, I think, is and where we resonate with that, especially with frontline work. However, I mean, for me, harm reduction looked a little bit different currently or within the last few years of my life based off of, things I knew that I wasn't going to be able to handle or do, and I had to take control of it. That also goes to show when people are requiring harm reduction supplies or people are requiring some form of harm reduction mindset and that's not provided to them, that causes way more harm.
Absolutely, especially when their solution or the thing that they want to do doesn't affect anyone else.
Literally just themselves.
Like, just let them do it if that's what's gonna help them get through life and let them thrive and be happy.
Yeah. Well, we definitely need more healthcare practitioners and healthcare people on board with some of these things as well. Because I think, yeah, even thinking back on doctors that I've had or, nurses that I've encountered and some of the framework that they have around harm reduction is maybe a little bit different than what people who are working in communities are seeing.
Yeah.
and I'm very much talking about in hospital institutionalized setting versus community, not community nurses or community practitioners. I'm not talking about that, but just bridging that gap somehow so that more can be offered and people can be heard in a new way that maybe isn't going to be dismissed as easily as I know a lot of clients that I've worked with, and I'm sure you have as well, have been dismissed by other healthcare practitioners looking for harm reductive practices or things that are going to help around harm reduction for them, but maybe that's seen as a little bit taboo and immediately dismissed instead of talking about it further, which I think would make a huge difference in so many community members' lives.
Absolutely. Like we need to start listening to individuals when it comes to their own like
Absolutely.
well-being and their own care. Like who are we to tell them that no, I know better what's better for you and what's good for you.
Mm.
Like we need to like stop talking and let this individual tell you what they need and what they want in that moment, and how can we support them in achieving what they need to achieve in a safe way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So the next big question that we're going to dive into, I think, is around pivotal events where harm reduction has proven to work.
So pivotal events. So let's talk about Insight, which is located in Vancouver's downtown east side. It was North America's original supervised injection site, which was officially and legally opened in 2003. However, its roots run quite deep thanks to the efforts of M. Livingston and others who operated underground for years prior to its doors opening officially. It was driven by the urgent need to protect folks from the rising rates of overdoses and HIV infections. And that's what it did. It did its job. HIV rates dipped and less people were dying from overdoses. The impact of Insight is undeniable. It literally saves lives. By offering a safe environment for drug use and comprehensive supportive services, these sites help address the complex health needs of individuals with substance use, ultimately leading to cost savings and improved public health outcomes. So I can't imagine like how much more money we could save if we just opened up more safe injection site or safe consumption sites all across the country. Because like when you're handing out fresh needles, that in itself is saving lots of money because people are no longer, or like the last people are having to go to the hospital because of, jagged needles that are cutting their skin and causing infections. And yeah. And yeah.
And yeah.
And yeah.
That's really cool. That makes me think of some courses and some research that I've been doing on my own around LGBTQ history. And one of the things that comes up and was a very, pivotal moment when gay men and lesbian women were kind of being umbrella termed under, the homophile movement. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. And basically there was so much misogyny that it was split up, and there was, I want to say, Del Martin and someone else who had spearheaded a lot of movements that were more directed towards lesbian women, and then HIV and AIDS and everything that was happening in the 80s. Yeah. And all these queer men, a lot of these statistics are also for white men, so I just want to take space and acknowledge that intersectionality was not a thing yet. And they were being refused from hospitals. Their families didn't want them because no one really understood anything. The government and healthcare was like, this is scary. I don't know what's going on. Homophobia, get out of here. And it ended up being, all these different lesbians throughout this movement that took these people, like all these queer men that were infected with AIDS, HIV, all that stuff in the 80s, into their homes and like fed them chicken noodle soup and like bathed them and took care of them so that they could essentially live out their life more comfortably than being like basically kicked out onto the street from hospitals and their homes and their wives and their children, like didn't want anything to do with them. And that's why you don't see a lot of elderly queer men than you do lesbians, which I think is really cool. And I didn't realize that. And although it isn't the same terms as substance use and harm reduction that we do in that way, I feel that there's a lot of care that goes into harm reduction. And I think that's a very interesting moment of showing care and compassion for somebody, and harm reduction in the sense of maybe you won't die tomorrow. Maybe we can make you more comfortable throughout this experience for you until maybe there's another opportunity for HIV to have, for them to have more information about it, or maybe you just pass comfortably in care. And I think that can be a part of harm reduction where maybe the end goal isn't going to be treatment for this person. Yeah. And maybe the end goal is just to keep you as comfortable as possible until we know what the next step is for you and whatever that looks like.
Yeah, and that's like a really good point for like what harm reduction is, because harm reduction is about community care. And that's a really, like, I didn't know anything that you just said right now. That's actually like, really
Isn't
cool.
that so cool?
So to have all these like folks who cared so much about, these gay people, and like to bring them into their own home, just like Anne Livingston was, right, with like some people who were injecting. They were bringing folks into their own home, providing, hot meals, showers, basic needs, basically. And I know you said that, like, it's providing comfort, but it's also providing literally healthcare on a basic level, right?
Yeah, which healthcare providers refused to do because of maybe they were scared, maybe they were told not to, maybe there were more political things at play during that time because HIV was such a weird, scary thing for a lot of people, which it really didn't like that.
Yeah, and these safe havens where they were being provided like support and supply and basic needs, like these are preventative measures for what could have happened to their health, like had they just been alone on the street. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's been happening for forever in different ways, not necessarily labeled as harm reduction, but definitely there. Tracy, what do you think?
But yeah, I think a lot of individuals are afraid, and to a certain extent, it's normal. It's normal to be fearful of things that you don't fully understand, and then when there's propaganda as well going against it, that can make it feel a type of way too. And so we're really just in kind of this like melting pot of, is it good? Is it bad? Did a study on all of the studies that have been done on harm reduction. And what they found was there's literally not one actual peer-reviewed, scientifically found study that shows any negative impacts of harm reduction sites like safe injection sites or safe consumption sites. In fact, they all showed positive results for either saving money or saving the systems like time, or you all wanted to talk about like the one thing, show me the one thing, show me the evidence. It's like the evidence is there. They've done the evidence. It's literally there. Like, this is not hidden. This is not under the rocks. It's been going on for almost 40 years now in larger scientific medical fields around these things. It's there. This is not new. We're not reinventing the wheel. And I think just the average citizen doesn't know about it. And that's the issue, is that it's not spoken about enough. Like, the pros of these sites are not spoken about enough. And the only study in that cross-sectional study, might I add, that showed any sort of negative impacts was a pseudoscientific study done here in Calgary around how, around the safe consumption site, crime increased. And I don't even want to get further into it because crime didn't actually increase. Phone calls were made, and the phone calls were the indicators of quote unquote crime. And the thing about those phone calls is they weren't considered single incidents either. So if you think about, maybe there's someone yelling and I call, and, person down the street calls for the same person, and, person across the street's calling for the same person. That's 3 phone calls for one incident. But that's not how it was portrayed in that study. And now that study is being used in the US Supreme Court to strip rights around harm reduction as well.
Yeah, and like the thing I love about harm reduction is that, again, it's existed all over the world for so long. Everyone's been doing it.
So true.
Like anytime any situation where a group of people are being marginalized and not being cared for, there's always going to be a community of folks who step up and open their doors to provide the care that these people like need, right? And
Absolutely.
that's like one of my favorite part about harm reduction is literally the community care. It's the folks who care enough to disobey laws because they know
Actually.
that, you know, this is, I don't know what I'm trying to say with this, but like they know that like it's worth it to break the law to like provide care and support for these folks, because that's the human thing to do. It's, again, it's radicalized compassion. It's putting compassion into action.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing I think is interesting when we were completing and getting everything ready for the outline for this episode, and this question specifically, is I was thinking about all the times that I had maybe talked about harm reduction with other people that didn't work Frontline, and some of the pushback that I got was, you know, and I think ever since COVID, this has been a big thing. It's like, show me the evidence and show me this big thing that happened that now you think that harm reduction is going to work, et cetera, et cetera. And it always needs to fall on some big sort of extravagant message. And I think that, I mean, a lot of our community members don't even necessarily get included in some of the statistics that come up around harm reduction, and already a problem. But also, on a micro level, day-to-day interactions that frontline workers have and people providing harm reduction and radicalized empathy in communities, I mean, that's not going to be some big ticket hot event that you're going to see hot off the press necessarily. It's going to be little small wins, and we're going to definitely do episodes on small wins. And what that looks like. And I think that is just so much more telling of the care and the community care and harm reduction and how that works are in those small but very profound moments and interactions that we see in this line of work that we do. And I think that's not necessarily something that everyone is going to understand unless you've been in the field and you've worked that, or you've seen it, or you've lived it and you have that lived experience maybe. Or maybe all we need to do is just sit down and listen to each other a little bit more. I don't know. But the point that I'm trying to make is I don't think that we need some sort of big moment to be able to see here is when I noticed harm reduction working. It's always worked. You know? It's kind of going back to your seatbelt analogy. Show me the big event where seatbelts
saved all these lives.
Seatbelts are saving lives every day. Every freaking day that you get in your car and put your seatbelt on. That's like snapshot that into like how it's helpful. So I don't know.
Yeah.
That was a weird rant, but that's how I feel about it.
If we did start keeping track of how harm reduction has kept us alive or kept us safe in everyday life, it would be way too
astronomical.
Much. It would be, right? Like from seatbelt in the car to diet soda to hunting orange vests, and how many hunting accidents have that prevented?
So true.
Right? Like, so
true.
We don't talk about these like little things.
Yeah, walking your dog on a leash. I don't know.
There you go.
Holding your baby's head up so it doesn't.
Yeah, oven mitts.
Oven mitts. That's a big one.
Are we gonna make baking illegal? No, we're gonna
make baking illegal.
We're gonna put on some oven mitts and do it safely.
That is so
right?
so true.
We don't need to bake cookies, but we're gonna. You know,
we need to bake.
Imagine
cookies.
The government being like, "Don't do it because it'll burn your hands. It's not good for you." Cookies have too much sugar in them. No, we're gonna still do it. We
would have underground baking clubs, baking cookies all day, as it should be.
Underground baking clubs, as it should be. Dad is shaming people who are publicly baking cookies.
Well, if the government makes it illegal, Tracy, you can feel free to cut all of this out.
We're all like in tunnels.
Putting it in Ziploc, shipping it out. Hiding it in, when they like have it in the suitcases?
Yeah.
And they like shove it in the...
Yeah.
Anyway, Border Patrol, and they're like, where's the chocolate chip?
Unmarked chocolate chip cookies.
Unmarked chocolate chip cookies. Sorry.
Anyways.
Cut it. Cut it. Yeah.
Harm reduction has always existed, is our point.
Harm reduction has always existed. And it will continue to exist. As long as there's people willing to do that work and come together in community care, I think it's only gonna... My hope is that it just becomes more widespread in terms of understanding and knowledge and education, so that it doesn't have to be this like weird taboo thing that you talk about and people might not fully understand it who don't have that experience. It can be more widely accepted and spoken about so that it can open up more areas of harm reduction to help more people, more marginalized populations, etc.
Yeah.
Is my hope. So what we are wanting to do, especially after episodes where we're talking about some pretty complex topics, is have a little bit of a debrief session. So I'm going to open the floor up to Eileen and Tracy. How are we feeling? What are our thoughts? What are our hopes moving forward for harm reduction? Anything you want to say to kind of wrap up, or any, way to come back and ground each other after this big conversation? For me, I think it's really important to have these conversations, and I'm really grateful that I have the people that I work with, that I'm close to, that I'm really good friends with, that I can share these conversations with, and that makes me feel less alone. So I feel a lot more grounded after having these conversations with the both of you and with other colleagues and people in the field, or people that I've worked with for a while, even community members. Having these conversations, I think, is really important, and that's what helps me personally. And I learned so much in this podcast episode that we just did, let alone in so many other areas. So yeah, that was really cool for me.
Yeah. This conversation was, I think, very important to happen, and I'm going to have this conversation all the time, and I'm going to keep having these conversations, because I don't know, I feel like I'm out there to also destigmatize a lot of things, and
Yes.
And anytime anyone wants to shit talk harm reduction and give it all these like negative labels or whatever,
Destigmatizing is so important. And how do we destigmatize? By not talking about it and not, engulfing ourselves in these? Or like, we destigmatize by continuing to talk about it, share our stories, get educated?
Well, yeah, the whole purpose of like me picking this topic for this episode was my main goal was to destigmatize and to educate, because again, so many people have the wrong idea of what harm reduction actually is, and to be able to put it into like everyday practices that are like less scary, I think really helps put things into perspective, because it's like, they're like, oh yeah, diet soda, great, but then substance use, oh no, that's too scary. And it's like, it's not, we need to stop being afraid of these things. Just because something's unfamiliar to us doesn't mean it's scary, right? Like, there's...
Well, and the way that substance use is even painted just like at the beginning, before you even touch on harm reduction, I think is also something that needs to be addressed. That's for a whole other episode, obviously. I'm not going to get into it now, but I think that's a big starting point. In as soon as someone hears substance use, they think, oh, stop immediately, we need treatment, help, delete. And then harm reduction is coming in with a different approach. And I think the different approaches might be like the scariest thing, because it's like, why are we not trying to put an end to the use of substances, and we're actually like providing aid in this situation? And it's like, well, yeah, that's community care, that's meeting people where they're at, that's like, every single person is different.
Yeah. And also like just remolding the conversation around our reaction to substance use and mental health, because they hear drug use, that's bad, needs to be punished, right?
That's so, what I was trying to say. Yes.
Instead of being like, drug use, maybe find out why, maybe
Be curious. Yeah.
Be curious, not furious? What? Wild concept.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like harm reduction is about destigmatizing and then vamping the way that society reacts to substance use and neurodivergency and mental health. These are not things that folks should be punished for,
Absolutely.
but rather let's find out how to keep them safe when they're going through the things that they're doing and how to maximize their happiness and safety, right? So
Absolutely. That's the base of it when you really strip it down. That's what's at the core of it all.
yeah, and just like not forcing our idea of what happiness and our idea of what wellness and productive life and like why does someone need to be productive? I'm sorry, that's just the thing that's a hill I'm gonna die on. I don't believe that every human being on earth needs to be a productive human being.
Well, and what is productive?
What is productive? What? Contributing to a capitalistic society? Is that what we're trying to do? Are we Anyways.
No. I meant yeah. I think, yeah.
Just because
I
you're
agree.
not making money for the system doesn't mean you don't deserve housing and dignified care, right? Like
Yeah, it's the categorizing of other. I am othering this person. This person is not like me. I deserve all these resources and I deserve a roof over my head. But that person is doing something not productive, outside the norm, should be punishable, and therefore that person does not deserve XYZ. Like I deserve XYZ.
Yeah.
And I think especially in North America and westernized societies, that is a big individualistic, all of those things.
gatekeeping housing.
Gatekeeping.
That's freaking wild.
Isn't that
to
a wild
me.
take?
Gatekeeping food. Gatekeeping
Yeah, water, clean
basic
water.
needs. Like
Yeah.
like if we're whenever I'm preaching like everyone deserves housing, dignified housing and care and whatnot, and there are always folks who are going to sit on the high horse and be like, well, I worked hard for everything that I got. Why should we be handing out free things to folks who are not contributing as much as I am? And it's such a greedy, selfish, uncompassionate way of thinking. And
While they're sitting on their pile of wealth, looking down on other individuals and telling them how they should be living their life.
exactly, as if everybody came from the same freaking roots, same privilege, same situation.
Yeah.
I don't know, why is it so hard for people to just try to put themselves into other people's shoes and think a little bit deeper about what might be going on for other folks
Absolutely.
that you yourself have never experienced and would never be able to understand.
Harm reduction in a colonized state is not just about needles, and it's not just about, Skittles, though I love my Skittles. It is this bigger act of sometimes political defiance. And so, I appreciate Danny saying people get hung up on harm reduction and the term because it's so heavily stigmatized with substance use, which 100% it is. I would argue that any act against the system is harm reduction, and that the system is only accepting of harm reduction when it works for the system itself. And that's the piece that we got to be careful of. It's amazing that we have Insight and we have some other safe consumption sites. And I'm sitting in Alberta where, just a week or two ago, I was sitting in a collective talk around how the Alberta government has now collected all of the healthcare numbers of individuals who are using Safe Supply. And now the Alberta government wants to go into a forced treatment model. And now they have all of these medical numbers. And like it just, we need to stop and think for a second. Like some of these tools that are being released as harm reduction for us to help us are also being used against us. And we always need to be critically thinking of like, why? Why is a maybe more conservative government going this direction? What is their ultimate goal? What is their ultimate plan? Because I would ultimately argue that harm reduction is individualized care. And how do you get individualized care in a systemic operation? And that's what our governments are. It's what our healthcare is. It's literally what everything around us is. And I can't not stop thinking about that and be worried as well. Be worried for all of, the individuals out there who now the government has their medical number and like now they want to roll out forced treatment. And how are they going to do that? Who is going to be put into forced treatment? And those facilities and how they look, they're not looking like treatment centers, I can tell you that. I don't know. I'm worried. I'm really worried, truthfully. I'm worried about the government co-opting harm reduction and the healthcare system co-opting harm reduction. And I think maybe I'm just a very untrusting individual. I know I am, but I think there's something to be said about that too.
That felt very cathartic. I feel like sometimes debriefs are vent sessions, and that's okay.
I'm just getting more angry.
I'm just getting angry. Yeah, debriefing doesn't always have to be sitting and breathing and meditating. I think it can be really just like letting it.
This is how I feel. Blah.
Letting it out. Yeah, without having to be so polished and perfect in the way that we're expressing ourselves. So I appreciate Tracy and Eileen you holding space for me in this episode for that. And I appreciate the both of you and having this conversation with the both of you because I love you so much. If you are stumbling across this podcast and you want to find out more about Frontline Baddies and, you want to get more updates, see cool memes. We have very cool memes on our Instagram page. You can find us at Frontline Baddies on Instagram, at Frontline Baddies Podcast on Instagram, and our website, www.frontlinebaddies.com.